Mark, any amateur radio operators in the house? Anybody? Oh, got one. Okay. If y'all know that guy, you got to get to be his friends. And we'll get to that in a little while. This is one of my favorite quotes. It's "Chance favors the prepared mind." And this is kind of where I'm going tonight with this. You know, there are a lot of things that are left to chance or left up to God, but there are also things that are left up to our ability to prepare for things, I believe. And this is why I prepare, so I don't end up with a super bill. So everybody's probably going, who am I? I do that every morning. First off, I'm going to tell you who I'm not. I'm not a professional speaker. I work on oil and gas wells for a living up in southern Oklahoma. I get paid basically more from the net down. So those of you who are professional speakers or you do presentations for a living, you know the little list they give you of everything not to do? I guarantee I'll break every single one of those rules tonight. So if you're bored, you can keep track of how many things I do wrong. I'm not an expert. I'm a layman on this. I've got some background and some training in some different areas. I get kind of nervous about anybody who says they are an expert in something like this. I'm not a 2012er. I don't believe the Earth is going to end on, what is it, December 21st? Is that right, 2012? I'm not a doomsday guy. However, things like about 2012 concern me, just like about the Y2K thing. You know, with the public and Y2K, because there was so much unknown, you know, everybody was kind of a little bit on edge. And so I think 2012 could end up being an interesting year. The elections, the whole 9 yards, people already on edge. You know, we could be in the middle of a recovery, or we could be in a full-blown depression by then. I'm not a militia nut waiting for the revolution. If you are a militia nut waiting for the revolution, I got some bad news for you. It's not going to happen, and if it does happen, it's not going to be good. A lot of people see themselves as a George Washington or Thomas Jefferson or one of those, which you'll usually end up being as a Ted Kaczynski or a Timothy McVeigh. The way to change it is what y'all are doing here. This is the best way to bring change about to our country. This is the way our country is established. And I'm not a white, black, brown, red, yellow supremacist. I bring this up because when you start to go into this, you're going to run across a lot of these people that are some kind of a race supremacist. And there are each one of these groups. There are Asian race supremacists, there are Mexican race supremacists, there are black supremacists, there are white supremacists. You'll find some of these in the survivalism part of this. I don't like to say I'm a survivalist. I like to say I'm a prepper. I believe in change like y'all are doing it through the democratic form of our government, but I also believe in preparing for the unknown. And I think survivalists too often are the guys that like to go, well, I take that back because I like to blow stuff up. But the survivalists are the guys that like to blow up the wrong things. Okay, so who am I? Well, let me grab my notebook pad here. First off, I'm a believer in salvation through the Lord Jesus Christ and the absolute authority of the Scripture. And that viewpoint, I try to apply to everything in the world, what goes on, what I do, what I behave, who I am. I'm an Oldfield brat. When I was 18 months old, we moved to Libya. A couple of years after that, we moved to Dubai. And then we moved to Scotland. And we moved to Houston. And we moved back to Scotland. And we moved back to Houston. So I kind of grew up with a little bit of a world experience. I'm probably one of the only people that joined the Marine Corps and asked not to go overseas. Because I had seen 3 continents, but I'd seen 2 states. So when I joined the Marines, I ended up in a little submarine base in southern Georgia. I was a member of a security force group. I was a Boy Scout. When I got out of the Marines, I was a volunteer firefighter for a couple of years. Really didn't want to do it. It was that 94, 95 time period when we were having all those grass fires. And here's this ex-Marine that lives up in Argyle. And I happened to stop and help out on a grass fire, and so the fire chief recruited me. I said, hey, Chief, I'll fight all the grass fires that you got, but I am not going in a burning house. That is not my intention. I have no desire to do that. What I wanted to do was go into law enforcement. And this is one of those things, there's a country song out there that says, if you want to hear God laugh, tell him what your plans are. That was my intent. I was going to be a federal law enforcement officer. I went to the police academy, graduated, got on with a local agency here as a volunteer police officer. So I was still going to college and I was working in the oil field. And I've been with that agency now for 16 years. I worked 6 years in narcotics. 4 of those were on a narcotics task force. About 98, the oil field crashed. Believe it or not, oil went down to $8 a barrel. I don't know if anybody remembers those days. Well, it was bad for somebody like me, so I went to work for a hazmat emergency response company. And I spent several years traveling around Oklahoma, Texas, went over to Colorado, down to Alabama, Louisiana, on different kind of oil spills, train derailments, truck wrecks, big natural disasters, tornadoes. Kind of gave me a little bit of insight into how some of that stuff goes. So anyway, in 2002, I went back into the oil field, and that's where I've been ever since. I live up in Ponder, but I work in Marietta, Oklahoma, so I commute about 60 miles every day. So how did I get here? Well, like most of y'all, September 11th kind of caught my attention. I wasn't really as interested in the terrorist attack. I want to make sure I don't take me in the wrong context, because the terrorist attack was expected. I mean, anybody that knows current events, knows what's going on in the world, we expected this. You know, law enforcement, and even people that aren't. What really caught my attention was this little scene. And I don't know if y'all can tell, this projector's got a little bit of the cable's got a bad spot in it. These are the people trying to flee the island of Manhattan. And I've only flown through New York. I've never actually walked around and been around New York. I'm sure some of y'all have. Apparently, most of the people up there don't own cars. They rely on public transportation or whatever to get into work. So then you've got several million people on an island, and everything's shut down. And they have to walk several hours for some of them, I'm sure, to get off. So that's kind of what I was looking at, was the human reaction to the events. And then Hurricane Katrina kind of made me start thinking. I saw a whole section of our society that for the last 30 or 40 years has been completely dependent on the government for just about every decision in their life. Rita is the one, a few weeks later, that really made me see how vulnerable we are. And we saw scenes like these. Now, I lived in Houston twice. Once when I was in elementary and then once when I was in high school. Last time was for 4 years. I lived through, I don't know, a couple, 3 hurricanes there. We didn't do this. We had parties, you know. We'd just get in our houses, hunker down, hurricane would pass over, we'd come out, you know, fix whatever needed to be fixed, put the fences back up, go wading through the street. You know, Houston is south of Houston, between Houston and Galveston, where we lived. It's like 7 feet above sea level. I mean, you flush your commode wrong, the place floods, you know. But we never did this, so I started thinking, well, how did we get from the culture I grew up in the mid-'80s to where, okay, there's a hurricane coming, everybody get the plywood out of your garage, put it on your windows, and just wait for the hurricane to get through, to trying to evacuate several million people from a city that really didn't even get hit by the hurricane. So then I started looking at some headlines, and these are all news headlines. I've got a little email list I sometimes send deals out on. These are some I've sent out in the last few years. This first one really got my attention. It says slightly over half of all Americans, 52.6%, now receive significant income from government programs. At this time, in 2007, 1 out of every 5 people is either employed by the government or a government contractor. Well, that's not sustainable. 47.4% of us can't support 52.6% of us. And then there's a few others in there. There's another headline from MSNBC about economic angst has Americans stockpiling beans, bolts, and Band-Aids. Y'all can read on. The bottom one is kind of alarming. Also, that was, I think, from a year and a half or 2 years ago, so it's probably a lot higher. So that brings us to here. What are you guys concerned about? I mean, I'm sure economic collapse is probably pretty high on most of your list. But what else is there? I mean, terrorist attack. Are you concerned about a terrorist attack? Tornado? Kind of. Economic collapse. Airplane crash? Anybody around here when the plane went down off of 114? Y'all remember that? Imagine. Our society was a lot different then. Imagine what it would be like today. Especially with the messed up 114 and 121 right now. I mean, this could be a pretty serious changed for a lot of people for several weeks. Flooding, martial law. Martial law is kind of a, I don't know, it's kind of an interesting subject for me. First off, I told you I was in the Marines. I've got the highest respect for our military and their abilities. Afghanistan is the size of Texas, and we have gotten a pretty good chunk of our military there for 10 years now, and we still don't have control of it. I don't really foresee martial law being a serious problem anywhere in the United States except for in the major cities. I mean, call me crazy, but I don't see the National Guard marching on Justin, Texas, or Weatherford, or, maybe Denton, because Denton's a little different. Blizzard? Well, we would have laughed at this until Super Bowl weekend. Earthquake? Yeah, we have them here. They're not too bad, but there's a potential for them. Drought? Yeah, we'll find out about that right now. Wildfires? This is a pretty serious one for a lot of people, especially in this area. So what about things that you've never thought of? Does anybody know what electromagnetic pulse is? Anybody not know what electromagnetic pulse is? Real quick, electromagnetic pulse is the byproduct of a nuclear explosion. Basically what it does is it short circuits most electronics. They discovered this after Hiroshima, or Nagasaki, I can't remember which one, when they noticed that all the clocks around a certain diameter around the blast were stopped at the exact same time. Well, they did some research, and of course back then we used to just blow up nuclear weapons just to see what they would do. We don't do that now. They did one called the Starfish Prime over, it was actually over in the South Pacific, and it affected the island of Hawaii. Shut down the traffic light system and did some other stuff. So they discovered if you take a nuclear weapon, and this is all, electromagnetic pulse is kind of the boogeyman of this kind of a deal, because there's a lot of misinformation about it, and there's a lot of just pure unknown about it. You could study for years about what happens with this. But basically the theory is if we took a nuclear weapon, exploded it 100 or 200 miles over the United States, it would pretty much wipe out every electrical transformer in the U.S. That's a known fact. I mean, they know it would do that. Some people say it won't make your cars to where they won't work. Some people say it will. Some people say it'll affect, the computers and your remote control for your TV. What it does is it sends out an invisible pulse, and anywhere there's a length of wire, that pulse builds up and basically overloads whatever circuit's on that pulse. And I mean, we can go in for hours talking about this, but it does have the potential to send us back to the Stone Age for at least a short term, because one of the projections is if they did it to us, if a terrorist got a hold of a nuclear bomb, a decent sized one, launched it over the U.S., set it off, took out all the transformers in the U.S., we're looking at a minimum of probably 3 to 4 years to rebuild all those transformers, because there's not that many factories that make them anymore.
And what would the result be if all the transformers were knocked out?
No electricity. Totally wiped out the electric grid. Go ahead, sir.
On that same subject, look, I just didn't think I was going to name it. It wouldn't be too hard to find it, but about that same thing happened. What would happen to the country?
Yeah.
Written that one, you might.
I've probably got, it's called 1 Second After.
That's the one.
Yep, I've got that book, and
I don't
it's,
know what the results
yeah.
could be.
Well, that's the thing is, it's one of those things, you almost wish we'd take a nuclear bomb and say, I don't know, set it off over some city somewhere, not to kill the people, because it won't kill anybody, it just fries everything, so we can see what happens, because it's a lot of hype, a lot of theoretics, and it's a lot of physics and stuff that's way over my head. Go ahead, sir.
An N5 ICD the other way around.
Do what?
An N5 ICD the other way
Oh,
around.
good. Are you an extra, general?
General.
General, okay.
My concern is when you go down a list like this, it kind of reveals your political orientation. I'm more concerned about what would fail and what system would fail. And I think today's technology is really fragile when it's an electrical system and communication system.
Yes.
So you might want to look at plans built around a week-long failure of your electric system.
Yeah.
And nuclear attacks.
Yeah. And we're going to get in, I mean, there's a lot of natural, I'm about to get into CMEs and space weather, which, I mean, solar flares, that kind of thing. I mean, there's more than just the terrorists. Train derailments. If you've never sat in a train track and written down the little numbers on the sides of the cars and then looked them up, don't do it, because you'll never sleep again. pretty much everything you can imagine goes down our train tracks. In the late 70s, I believe it was, there was a town in California. It wasn't a big town. It was less than 100 residents, but it was wiped off the map by a train derailment because the train that derailed just happened to be carrying a bunch of bombs from the military. So it totally took the whole town out. I don't think they ever rebuilt it. Fuel storage. Anybody ever wonder where they get all the fuel that they put in the planes at DFW?
Right down on Continental Boulevard.
Yeah. Anybody remember when they were doing the DART expansion deal and they accidentally hit the jet fuel pipeline under, was that South Lake Trophy Club, one of those? Yeah. There's a lot of jet fuel that moves under our feet every day. I mean, there's a lot of planes that fly out of there. I can't imagine how much fuel they go through. Funniest thing, it's not funny, it's kind of sad. If y'all have been down to, what is that, Grapevine Colleyville ISD, that's built right across from that giant fuel storage depot. I'm like, okay, here's the school, and here's 1 million gallons of gasoline, 4 lanes across the road. I have a problem with this. I don't know what else. Do you know what's in there? Is it gasoline or jet fuel? It's all jet fuel? Okay, I didn't know. I knew it was some kind of a, fuel
burns.
storage.
Whatever it is, it burns.
Yeah. Sewage spill. Okay, now this one's going to make you laugh, but I got a good friend of mine that I worked with in law enforcement. Lived up in Louisville, woke up in the middle of the night, and him and 5 of his neighbors' houses were a foot deep in raw sewage. Do you know how our sewage systems work? Mainly they work off of gravity, but if you're in a lower subdivision and the sewage treatment plant is at a higher place, they pump it to a lift station. It basically flows to a lift pump and then it goes up and it's pumped into whatever the sewage treatment place is. Well, that pump had given out. This is in Louisville. I mean, Louisville paid for it all. They completely renovated their house, but they were out of it for 6 months. And we're going to get into, in just a second, about the difference between, well, that's not really a disaster.
It is.
It's a disaster if you live in that house. Space weather. This is another one that a lot of people don't realize. NASA, actually, I had it before on that other slide. NASA had an interesting article about how the sun can make your toilet stop working. There is a phenomenon called a coronal mass ejection, and I don't know enough about it to be that well educated. I just know it exists. I know that electric providers pay close attention to space weather. They try to balance things out and anticipate. They've got a certain amount of time that they can kind of detect something coming in. But in 1989, there was one of these in Ontario, I think it was, wiped out the electricity for 6 or 7 million people for like a day or 2 days or whatever. It has the potential to be similar to an electromagnetic pulse.
Is it like a solar flare?
It's a lot like a solar flare, and to be honest with you, I can't tell you the difference. I know there's X class and K class and all that, and I'd really like to find somebody that knows a lot about it and explain it to me. Living on an island. Now, I've got a lot of friends, lives down in Fort Worth in a pretty nice subdivision, really well kept houses, and the first time I went down there to see them, I noticed you had to drive through about 3 or 4 miles of not so nice places. So then I started looking on the map, and they're completely surrounded by strip clubs, bars, low-income housing, charismatic churches. Just kidding. Everything you can imagine that you don't want to be surrounded. So I'm looking at it, I'm going, well, they live on an island, and they're surrounded by sharks, And that's happened. I've seen that happen in, like, Louisville. Louisville's not the town that it was 20 years ago. And there are other parts that are that way. You kind of got to monitor stuff like that and be thinking, all right, well, is it maybe time to think about relocating? Refugees. If you looked at the homicide rates of San Antonio, Houston, or Dallas in the 6 months after Katrina, you'll understand where I'm going with this one. Now, this brings up an interesting point. I'm going to make an assumption that there's a lot of believers in here. And for us, charity is not an option. We have to take in the refugees. We have to take in the poor, the hungry, the sick. Even in a bad situation, if it means giving our last piece of bread, that's a commandment from God. But the flip side of it is, like the Katrina situation, that was all just bad planning. It was lack of planning. Explosive power blowout. I picked up a few dead bodies off the freeway from that. I mean, it doesn't sound like much, but what happens? $6 gasoline, $10 bread. What about breaking your leg? I'm pretty much self-employed, and If I don't work, the money doesn't come in. You know, and I know there's some of y'all that are probably in the same situation. So what have you done to prepare for if something happens to you? And another thing like this is getting fired. I actually had talked to a lady one time that her husband got fired, and they were disaster preparedness people, and luckily they had 3 or 4 months of food built up, and so they didn't have to make the choice between paying the electric bill or feeding the kids. So that's a whole other aspect that a lot of people don't think about. They think about, well, we're getting ready for tornadoes or whatever. You're getting ready for any hardship. So then we go to a crisis versus a disaster, and definitions are there, but my dad says the difference between a recession and a depression, a recession is when you lose your job, a depression is when I lose mine. So what might be a crisis to you is a disaster that happens to me. And this is the difference between our families in 1905 and our families in 2005. This is one of probably our biggest shortfalls as a society. I'm going to guess that most of y'all are probably a generation or 2 generations off of a farm or some kind of a self-sufficient family, Depression era, people that knew how to scrounge for themselves. Well, we've gotten comfortable here, and we don't have to do that, and we've lost all those skills. Okay, these are the 4 scriptures I usually get thrown at me a lot when I'm talking about this. Usually it's by somebody who feels that, you know, prosperity theology may be borderline. My problem with scriptures like these is if it doesn't line up with what's going on in the real world, then maybe your interpretation is off, or you're not understanding the whole context of the scripture. And typically it boils down to American Christianity versus Christianity in the rest of the world. If you go to church in China, or the Sudan, or Iran, or northern Kenya where they're burning churches right now, then those verses don't mean the same to them as they mean to a lot of Christians in America. And what goes back to Christian breadwinners don't get injured, we don't get cancer, nothing happens to us, we don't have accidents. So then I said, well, why do you save for retirement? Why have you got homeowners insurance? This is just another form of insurance that I try to get people to look into. It's something that you can do, and it goes everywhere, like we were saying, from terrorist attacks to natural phenomena to losing your job. I'm going to talk briefly on what I call the survival pyramid. A lot of people get into this and they start thinking physical stuff. Generators, bazookas, and canned foods, and MREs, and oh, it's a good excuse to go out and buy a Humvee, you know, that kind of stuff. The problem is there's more aspects to it than that. Physical stuff without the training does you no good. If y'all don't mind, y'all don't have to do this, but how many of y'all are CHL holders in here? Quite a few? Okay. How many of y'all have fired your weapons in the last 6 months? Good, good. That's good. That's really good because you usually don't run into that. It does you no good if you don't train with whatever you're going to do, whatever you're going to use. And we'll talk about that a little bit with food. I see a lot of people that stock up food, but they've never eaten that. Like they'll stock up that Mountain House dehydrated food, but they've never eaten it. They'll stock up MREs. As someone who had to eat MREs, it does interesting things to your digestive tract depending on which meal you fix. And if some of you can probably relate to what I'm talking about. I've got a saying that I don't know who said this originally, I wish I did. But people don't rise to the occasion, they default to the level of training. The other side of it is mental preparedness. This is by a guy named Lieutenant Colonel Dave Grossman. He wrote a book called On Killing. It was a fascinating book about how our society has evolved in the relations of combat and warfare. He's an incredibly intelligent guy. He went to West Point, and he said amateurs talk about hardware, but professionals talk about software. It doesn't matter. We'll go on there. But anyway, it matters what's in your heart and your head. And what he's saying basically is a lot of people get together and talk about gear, but what you really need to be talking about is how did people do how did they survive what they went through? And I've got a book that was over there. Y'all remember the movie that just came out, 127 Hours? You know the story about the guy? He was out hiking in some canyon somewhere. and the boulder fell on his arm. And after a couple of days, he finally pulled his Swiss Army knife out and cut his own arm off. That's what you need to look at. What is it that makes people able to do that, or the people that just would have sat there and died? Those are the people that win. And on the back of this, there's a list of books in the last page, and some of those deal specifically with the psychology of survival. This was my last commanding officer in the Marine Corps. He was actually a Lieutenant Colonel when I knew him. He's now a Major General, which I'm glad to see, because he was one of the most outstanding people I ever worked with. He would run 5 miles a day, and then he would come into the base and make us run 5, 6, 7, 8 miles with him. And I asked him one day, I said, Colonel Jackson, why do we run so much? And he looked at me and said, well, Corporal Bond, I like chocolate cake. And I either have to give up chocolate cake or I have to run. And if I have to run, I'm going to make all of you run with me. And I'm like, sir, I don't really like chocolate cake. I'd be excused. Anyway. But he had a saying, strong mind, strong body, strong spirit. You're only as strong as the weakest one of those. A couple more of the kind of mantras that I live by. Intelligent men learn from their mistakes, but wise men learn from the mistakes of others. We live in a time, unprecedented amount of information that we can get. The day after they had the earthquake in Japan, I got a blog, came across a blog from a wife of an American serviceman stationed over there talking about what happened, where they were at, what was going on, what was bad, what was good. I mean, every time there's a disaster, you can get on the internet and find first-hand accounts by just normal people living through that disaster about what's going on. And that's one of the things that I try to do. I try to read things like that and say, okay, well, this worked, this didn't work, you know, whatever. But unfortunately, I'm more like this guy. Good judgment comes from experience, and experience usually comes from bad judgment. And that's the way we are. You know, you're going to make mistakes, you're going to fail, things are going to go wrong. And you can either learn from it and improve yourself, or ignore it and just keep making the same mistake over and over. And I'm also, unfortunately, like this guy. This is a Will Rogers quote. Y'all can read that one. So, where do you fall? Which one of the three are you? At different points in my life, I am each one of those three. So what's the first step? Well, let's identify what you're interested in. What are you concerned about? You know, I live in Ponder. I don't know if any of y'all, actually I live north. I live between Ponder and Crump. Okay, so I'm surrounded by wheat fields. So rioting, you know, maybe the cows. That's about it. You know, you have different, depending on where you are and who you are, you have different vulnerabilities than I do. You need to identify your vulnerabilities. Things like you wear glasses, blood pressure medicine, diabetes. These are things that you need to take into account for and talk to your doctors and stuff about if you're going to plan for disasters. And you'll be surprised if you go to your doctor and say, hey doc, I'm worried about what happens if medication routes get cut off because of something, you know, Port of Houston has something wrong and they can't get meds in, or we have a tornado, or we lose power. Most doctors will write you prescriptions for a month's worth of medicine ahead of time that you can stockpile. And you need to remember to rotate it though. Don't just stick it somewhere. You need to use what you get. Make a plan. Preferably if you have a family, you make a plan for your whole family and you all sit down and know what the plan is. Prepare and educate yourself. Prepare for what you're concerned about and get online, get on the news, go to whatever source you can get, read about people that have had similar situations, learn from their mistakes and their successes. And then go back. You have to go back, start over, and evaluate where you are. Because your things are going to change. The things I prepared for 3 years ago aren't really the same kind. Well, they are, but there are different aspects now with different things that have been developed, different concerns. This isn't a goal. It's an ongoing process, and it's a lifestyle change. It's something that you just implement into your life. Okay, I'm going to talk more on communications. Well, we're going to go a few slides on communications. I've been involved in every kind of a disaster except an earthquake, a tsunami, and a volcano. But I saw the movie with Tommy Lee Jones. I think I'm pretty well prepared for that. The biggest problem in every situation I've ever been in is communications. It's always what fails. And there's two types of communication. Communications in, information you receive about what to do, what's going on, what's happening, and the communications you send out to your family, loved ones, and things like that. I'm an options guy. I like having a lot of options. Y'all pass my truck coming in. It's the one with like 7 antennas on top of it. You know, I can listen to just about anybody, talk to whoever. I can actually sit in that truck and talk to guys out in California now that we have repeaters that are linked up by the internet. It's amazing stuff. But anyway, so there's TV, there's satellite, there's cable. Most of y'all, I'm going to assume, are either on satellite or cable or Fios or something like that. How many of y'all are strictly broadcast TV people? You have an antenna outside your house, that's all you have. Okay. You need to talk to these two to learn what they did to be broadcast TV people. Because satellite systems are going to fail, cable companies are going to not be able to provide service. If all you got to do is go to Radio Shack and buy a $30 antenna you can throw on your house in emergency and hook up to your TV, it's better than not having any information at all. Broadcast radio, AM, FM, shortwave, satellite. Now, I'm sure most of y'all are familiar with AM, FM, and then the Sirius XM satellite. How many people remember shortwave radio? It's still out there. There are still books that are published at Barnes & Noble, magazines published, Popular Communications is one, Monitoring Times. There are even still pirate radio stations. Y'all remember the pirate radio station? Well, I don't, because I wasn't alive. But the pirate radio stations back in the 60s and stuff, they're still out there. They're in existence. And the schedules are published in these magazines, Barnes & Noble. You can get a little shortwave radio, like, let's see, I got one right here. It's like a $30 little Radio Shack radio. You can hook a little antenna up to, you can use this little antenna at night. You can also get a little piece of random wire and stick on it, 20 or 30 feet long, and pick up stuff from all over the world. Now I bring that up because I'm one of those guys that I like Fox News and everybody else like that, but I also enjoy seeing what the BBC is saying, or even what Al Jazeera is saying. Al Jazeera, like it or not, is a top-notch international news agency, and they've got a lot of information out there. They have journalists in places that we're not allowed to have journalists. Landlines, cell phones, we'll talk about that in a minute. Who has a weather radio in their house? Okay, it's another thing. Really stress this. They sell them at Walmart for like 20 bucks. You can't beat them. And there's a new change. This is a little Midland they sell at Walmart. It plugs into the wall, but it also runs on battery. This one has an alert capability, so when they send a tone out, it sets the radio off. The Weather Service is the one that runs this program, but they've changed these to be for weather radios to be all hazard radios. And they're going to start using these in the event of a terrorist attack or some other disaster, natural disaster or whatever. And they're also going to be doing, the president, whoever happens to be the president, this has been in the works for a long time, has the ability to broadcast on these now in the event of some kind of a major incident. This is probably one of the cheapest insurance you can have. Now, there is a little bit of an adjustment period because in the spring, this thing's going to go off every other night at 3 o'clock in the morning. When I talked to my sister, this is my sister by the way, when I talked her into getting one, I got a lot of text messages saying the little white box won't shut up. Yeah, but if the tornadoes come into your house, it's kind of nice to know. There's also Frs and Cb Radio. They're still around. There's still options for communicating around your little neighborhood, but they're not any kind of a long-distance deal. And finally, ham radio. I'll talk about that in a minute. I'm a big proponent of ham radio. To me, ham radio is the ultimate communications tool. And the more I learn about it, I've only been a ham for a couple of years, but the more I learn about it, the more it just amazes me what you can do. There are guys that talk from their ham radios to the International Space Station. There's a group of guys, and I think it's the 6 meters that bounce off the moon. The 6 meter guys, yeah, they use the moon as a reflector for their signals. I mean, there's some amazing stuff. There are ham radio satellites up there that relay signals back and forth. In communications, redundancy is your key here. You need more than one way to send a message, and especially get information in. You need a backup and even backup communications methods. And I highly recommend verification. When you're in a disaster or crisis situation, you try to verify whatever the message is that you receive. You do that by saying, see, is Tom, is that right? Tom? Okay, say Tom and I go to church together, and the Joneses' house just burned down. It's the middle of the night. And I get a call from the pastor saying, hey, the Jones are in this hotel with their 17 kids. They don't have any food. We need to get them some food. Well, it dawns on me, the church pantry doesn't really have that much food, so I'm going to holler at Tom and I'll go meet him over at Albertsons. Well, I'm thinking church pantry, but I mean to say Albertsons, so I send him a text message and say, hey Tom, let's go meet at the church pantry so we can get some food for the Joneses whose house just burned down. So if he answers okay, I'm going to be at Albertsons and he's going to be at the church pantry. And so this is just a real simple example of this. So what he really needs to tell me is, okay, I'm headed out the door, I'll meet you at the church pantry. And all of a sudden I'm going to be like, oh, wait a minute, I'm in Albertsons, you know. Because we've all done that. It's not even the middle of the night. Sometimes our brain's thinking one thing and our fingers are texting something else. Y'all been there, you know what I'm talking about. How many people still have landlines in their house? Oh, outstanding. I like to see that. Landlines so far have been the most reliable form of communications. The hurricanes that we went through and some of the flooding and stuff that I've been through, I've never seen. Now they do go out, but I've never had them go out on us. Go ahead, sir.
There's a difference between landlines that you're thinking of, which is the battery powered, you pick it up and get dialed phone.
Yeah.
Most of us have to buy us or another.
I was going to ask somebody about that. I don't have any experience with fiber optics.
If it's a battery in your garage and then install in your system, it lasts about 4 or 5 days.
16 hours, 4 or 5 hours.
Okay.
About 18 to 24 hours.
Yeah, depending on what it is. Well, so is there a way to back that up?
No.
You can't do anything, you can't do that in yourself? Okay.
No, you can back it up as long as the battery works, but the network system that runs files is extremely more complex than what we
Okay.
call the POT system,
Yeah.
like old telephones.
Well, I put that on there on that last line. I wasn't sure about fiber optics because I've never had any experience with it.
It's really not the same. If you want the ultimate reliability, you get a twisted pair of copper.
Yeah.
Come into your house with 48-volt battery, and that's the true way of it.
I'm telling you, I mean, I've seen not have power for a week and those old phones still work. Go ahead, sir.
In New York City, you're going to get power outage. Entire 8 million people on planes, fingers, phones, that type of thing.
Yeah. Yep.
You don't need anything. The other thing to think about is, even if you bring a phone line into your house and you've got wireless phones, and the
Exactly.
power's out, they don't
Not
work.
cordless
So you
phones.
not only need the copper, you need to go down and to get on eBay or something,
Yeah.
and buy some old.
Buy that cheap little $5 Radio Shack phone. I had that on there. Don't buy cordless. Cell phones are typically not as reliable as landlines due to their dependence on a lot of, and I've got it all listed up there. But I really want to talk to you about text messages. Does everybody hear text message? Okay, but you all have cell phones? I'm going to encourage you, and the federal government is even encouraging the disaster people to utilize text messaging. And here's the example. Let's say I live here in, I guess Grapevine's like what, about a mile, 2 miles, Lake Grapevine's that way, and it's mostly core property, I'm assuming. Let's say I live somewhere around here, and somebody calls me and they say, hey David, I know you live right there in South Lake. I just heard there was a massive wildfire in the core property. There's a front coming in from the north with some really gusty winds. They're telling everybody you need to evacuate. So grab Toto in your bag and get out of the house. Okay, well that was like 30 seconds. A text message, that's only like a second worth of data. It's called bandwidth. And a voice conversation takes up a lot of bandwidth, but a text message takes up very little. And I've seen people that have gone